Welcome to the short session of Standardized Recipes presented by the Oregon Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs. In this short session, Show Me How and Tell Me More, we will cover a summary of requirements, how to use the information provided on standardized recipes, and where to find additional resources. The recipe standardization process can be summarized in three phases: recipe testing, recipe evaluation, and recipe adjustment. Recipe testing consists of writing and reviewing the recipe in detail, preparing it, verifying its yield, and recording changes. Recipe evaluation focuses on determining the acceptability of the product produced from the recipe. And finally, the recipe adjustment phase includes changing the recipe yield and the ingredient amounts to meet the needs of the operation and incorporate feedback given during the evaluation. A recipe may go through these phases several times before becoming final. Kitchen managers and employees should work together on this process and receive input and feedback from participants and other customers along the way. Let's take a brief look at each of these steps to get a sense of the process from start to finish. Sponsors can source recipes from a number of places: cookbooks, online cooking sites, family recipes, institutions, etc. Regardless of where the recipe came from, it is important that it goes through all three phases before it is put on the menu. The first phase of the recipe standardization process is the recipe testing phase. This phase includes three main steps. Step 1. Create the recipe using a recipe format that will best fit the needs of your operation. Review the written recipe before preparing it to ensure the recipe contains the required 12 components such as recipe title, ingredient measures, etc. Look at each component and make any notes or adjustments that may not work for your operation, especially if you are adopting the recipe from another organization. Step 2. Prepare the recipe. Once the recipe has been reviewed, it can be prepared. It is recommended when making the first version of any recipe to yield 25 servings. Be sure to take notes during preparation about any changes or issues you may have. Record this information directly on the recipe for future reference. The more detailed the information is on the recipe, the more certainty of having a consistent quality product. Step 3. Verify yields. This step includes verifying ingredient, recipe, and serving yields. When verifying a recipe, the as-purchased quantity needed to yield the necessary edible portion quantity of an ingredient must be determined. Yields can vary depending on factors such as product quality, preparation techniques, and cooking times and temperatures. Verification of the recipe yields occurs once all of the ingredients have been combined and the recipe preparation completed. The yield can be determined several ways depending on the recipe. Recipe yield should be specified in both total quantity, weight and/or volume, and in the number of servings, and can be determined by weighing the final product or measuring its volume. Once the yields are verified, the recipe is ready for the next phase of the standardization process, recipe evaluation phase. Recipe evaluation follows the recipe testing phase and is an important part of the recipe standardization process. It will help determine acceptability of the recipe, taste, texture, appearance, etc., and will provide information that can be used to further improve the recipe. Recipe evaluation should include the manager, food service staff members, and customers, and can also include participants, teachers, administrators, and parents. Two types of evaluation occur in the evaluation phase: informal and formal. Informal evaluation involves only the food service managers and employees. During informal evaluation, the product is prepared for the first time in the operation and evaluated. This evaluation will determine if the recipe is acceptable to move to the next phase of the process. 3 decisions are possible as a result of the informal evaluation of a recipe. If the product was found to be totally unacceptable based on several of the informal evaluation criteria, the decision may be made to discontinue any further work on standardizing the recipe. If most of the informal evaluation criteria were rated as acceptable, the recipe may go back to the testing phase to allow changes to be made to the recipe and a new version of the recipe prepared. Finally, if all evaluation criteria were rated as acceptable in the informal evaluation, then the recipe may be prepared for formal evaluation. Formal evaluation occurs when the food service staff believes a recipe has potential for service in their operation. Procedures for conducting a formal evaluation of the recipe may include selecting a group of participants and/or staff to sample the recipe and complete an evaluation form. The evaluation form used should be appropriate for the age of the group members who are sampling the food items. It should address the questions the food service manager and employees want answered, be easy for the evaluators to read and complete, and should provide the information needed to adequately evaluate the product. Once the group and the form is finalized, plan a time and location to host the sampling and have participants taste the food and complete the evaluation. Summarize the results and move forward with either accepting the recipe as is, making suggested modifications, or discontinuing the recipe if it is not positively received. When a recipe has been evaluated positively in the recipe evaluation phase but is not in the desired quantity, it would move to the recipe adjustment phase of the standardization process. There are several methods that can be used to adjust a recipe to get to the desired number of servings. Some methods are done manually, others involve the use of a computer. One quick and easy way to adjust recipe yields is using the factor method. The factor method for adjusting recipes involves mathematical calculations and is the most commonly used method of manual adjustment. It can be done in three basic steps. The first step is to determine the factor to be used. The factor is a multiplier that will be used to increase or decrease the quantity of ingredients in a recipe. The factor is determined by dividing the desired yield in number of servings by the current recipe yield in number of servings. In addition, food service managers may find it easier to convert quantities that are in multiple units, such as quarts and cups, to one unit, such as cups, before doing calculations. In the second step, multiply each ingredient quantity by the factor. Each ingredient quantity in a recipe is multiplied by the factor to determine the ingredient quantity needed to produce the new yield. Ingredient quantities given as fractions would need to be converted to decimals prior to doing this calculation. In addition, food service managers may find it easier to convert quantities that are in multiple units, such as quarts and cups, to one unit, such as cups, before doing calculations. In the third step, change amounts into more common measurements. Often the result of the mathematical calculations is a quantity that is hard to measure or is not commonly used. These quantities may need to be converted to a more common measurement. Rounding to the nearest common measure also may occur. Be aware that several categories of ingredients do not increase proportionately to the increase in other ingredients, such as herbs, spices, leavening agents such as baking soda, baking powder, or yeast, thickening agents such as flour, cornstarch, and eggs, and liquid such as water and juice. Be sure to retest the recipe once adjusting the yield to ensure ingredients were converted properly.